Everyone. I just wanted to make a shout out to my WHAAP members. Typically we have our virtual conference or our conference around this time, but of course with COVID and PNRC conference happening at the same time, we decided not to have it this year. And every year the state auditor's office comes out to us and they provide us updates, and they give us a wonderful session, and it's our time to touch base with them and having a Q&A session. And this is something that I know that they wanted to talk to us about back in April when we were going to have our PNRC conference, but it was just really nice for Michael and the PNRC group to allow us this time during the PNRC conference to have a nice WHAAP membership conversation with them. So thank you for joining. I think we're probably going to have a lot more coming in. Our president of the Washington Housing Authority's accounting professionals, Wendy, is actually on vacation this week. How dare she? But if there are any other officers on, I think there's Pam, I think you're on. I know Hermelinda is not on, and I think Becky is on. They are here. I am a past president, but they are here to help answer your questions about the Washington Housing Authority accounting professionals if you are not a member. Please feel free to reach out to us. So with that, thank you, State Auditor's Office, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. All right, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sadie Armijo, and I am the Director of State Audit and Special Investigations. And with me today is Brandy Pritchard, and she's the Assistant Director of Local Audit and Special Investigations. What we want to talk to you today about is some of the lessons learned that we've had in the last year, and really want to talk to you about the largest misappropriation that we have ever investigated. So next slide, Brandy. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about the case overview, talk about how this case compares to some of the others, and really want to share with you some of the things that we can learn from this particular case. So in summary, what we're going to talk about is the Pierce County Housing Authority. And this was a fraud or misappropriation that happened from March of 2016 through July of 2019. It was a little bit over 3 years before it was stopped. This was a multi-dimensional fraud using various different types of losses through wire transfers, automated clearinghouse transactions, and credit cards, with a total loss to the Housing Authority of almost $7 million. So it's very unfortunate, and all of you know that that much money can do a whole lot for your housing authority. So we're going to get into a little bit of the details and how we detected this. So next slide. So while we were doing our regular audit, our regular routine audit of Pierce County Housing Authority, we were doing the financial statement, federal, and accountability audit. One of the auditors in charge, she kind of started to realize some really strange looking wire transfers that didn't make a lot of sense. You all know when we come on site and do your audits, we read your minutes. We look in detail at what goes on and what's happening and decisions that have been made. And this wire transfer wasn't making a lot of sense. And what was really throwing her off was the name of the bank. It was a bank that, you know, has been on the audit for a couple years and realized this is a bank that we haven't done business with. So what is this all about? And then, you know, just looking it up, realized that this is an out-of-state bank. So, and it had to do with the title. And so what was being purchased at out-of-state for in-state housing authority? Everything seemed a little strange. So she started to ask some more questions. The finance director was not actually there at the time. So she asked other people who worked in the finance department, and they said, well, this has to do with investments. Well, at least that's what it said in the system. And so, well, you're going to have to talk to Kova. Kova is the person who did this fraud and was the finance director. And she wasn't there. So went to the executive director, asked him a couple questions, and he wasn't aware of any investments or these numbers. And so in the meantime, one of those things auditors do is we send bank confirmations to really see if the housing authority had actually an account at these banks. So then we kind of kick into, okay, we wait about a week and then the finance director comes back. So next slide, Brandy. So what did the finance director say? So this was kind of interesting. So we asked the finance director, and what she said was, you know, these were investments that I purchased, and we usually do it with Key Bank, but we decided to use a different bank. But then I realized I didn't get the right approvals, so we didn't actually, I went back and I canceled those investments. And so that actually is an investment we didn't buy, and it was canceled. So that comes to the next point. So next slide. So this is a picture of Kova. This is actually a statement from what she said in her disposition. And what she said to them was it was an investment purchased, but they didn't have the proper approvals for it. So that's just kind of the description that she gave. And so that was just something where you have a situation where this was an employee who worked for the housing authority for over 20 years. And again, you see that for, it looks like the first 16 and a half, 17 years, she wasn't doing anything wrong and not stealing, but you get to a point where you're like, something happened. We don't know what that was, but the explanations and the lies, you come to trust somebody. And so what she said sounded reasonable. Now, from an audit perspective, we could have just taken her word for it, even though it wasn't all lining up. But instead, the auditor in charge took an important step. So next slide, Brandy. When we ask a lot of questions during our audit, one of the things that we're doing is we're asking you questions, and then we have to do additional work to verify what you're saying is true. So the auditor was, okay, I'm not going to necessarily take Kova's word for this. So what'd she do? She went back and looked at the bank statements in the future to see if it's true. If that was an investment purchase and it didn't get the proper authority or proper approval, did it get canceled? And she did not see that in this situation. And so we're back to a point where, okay, that looks strange. And then the other thing that was interesting is those bank confirmations came back. And they stated that there was absolutely, that the housing authority had no bank accounts at that bank. So that comes back to a situation of, okay, now we really do have a problem that we have to deal with. So next slide, Brandy. So first, I always want to start this slide with just a little bit of background. So when anyone feels like they found fraud, the first thing someone in our office does as an auditor is they call our fraud manager. So that is what this auditor did, is she called the fraud manager, and they started to try to get a little bit creative, like, okay, there is money going from the housing authority to a bank account that does not belong to the housing authority. And it also has to do with, we know the finance director had something to do with it. So here's the first thing. We do not regularly look at Facebook accounts of employees of any of our audit clients. This is not something that's in our playbook for audit, but this was a weird situation. So we went to the finance director's Facebook, we found her husband's name, and then we searched around on his Facebook page a little bit, and we determined where he lived. And he lived out of state, and he lived in Oklahoma. So we went to the assessor's office in the city that he lived in, and we found property purchase for the same amount as the wire to the title company in that same month. So right then and there, we solidified that we had a problem. And the next step was we went and talked with the executive director. And I really want to say at this point in time, the Pierce County Housing Authority was great to work with. They did all the right things and were really, really helpful. The first thing they did was they put the finance director on leave, and they helped to secure the location and also make sure that we could get all of the data and all the records that we needed. And so again, it was a situation where we needed them to act fast, and they did. So we really, really appreciated that. Next slide, Brandy. So when we get into the bank statements and we started to look, one of the things that we noticed was we obviously put in subpoenas and we got a whole bunch of additional records, and we worked with the housing authority to get those. We saw a lot of these wires, and this was really in 2018 and 19. And what you can see is these wire transfers that were going out were going directly to COVA. And in 1 month, this is just in 1 month period, it was over $300,000 that was just being directly wired to her bank accounts. So in total, we ended up with 10 direct wire transfers for a total of just a little bit over $3 million. But this wasn't the largest piece of it. So we'll go into the next part, which has to do with vendor payments. So this was a little bit this took us a little bit more work, but the thing is in this situation, there were some other red flags that cropped up pretty fast too. In this situation, they have a general ledger that seems to work just fine. But one of the things that happened is they actually had a second accounting system because they felt like the general ledger system was a little clunky when they were doing bank reconciliations. So they had an additional system, and that additional system happened to be QuickBooks. So now you have your main accounting general ledger, and you have a separate accounting system that is just helping them do those bank deposits. And that's kind of a red flag, because you know what, that general ledger and that extra accounting system, they sure better match, and they sure better agree to that bank statement. So we'll move on to the next slide, Brandy. So this is kind of what we're expecting. You got your general ledger, and it reconciles to the second system. And then at a later point in the month, there would be a reconciliation between the bank statements and that second system. And then, you know, transactions would be going into both. So if you switch to the next slide, Brandy, our expectation is all of these systems should agree. The ins and outs of the bank statement should agree to the general ledger and also that second system. But what we found was that was not the case. So what we saw was you have a vendor transaction, ACH clearing the bank statement, and then you also see it in the second system, but that wasn't the case for all of them. Then we saw a whole bunch of ACH transactions that were basically voided in the general ledger. And so those were the ones that we really keyed in on, because that helped us to identify which ones were actually fraudulent transactions. So we'll move on to the next slide. So as we went in there and we looked at it, you know, an ACH batch, that's something where was a little tricky, because what the finance director actually did in this case is she used valid vendors that the housing authority used on a regular basis to perpetrate this misappropriation. She would either modify what a statement looked like and alter it or falsify it, or just, you know, make some minor tweaks to an outstanding bill that would have come in. So this vendor was still getting paid for the services they did, but what happened is the routing number on the invoices that she falsely created, actually was routing to her personal bank account. So you all know that when you do an ACH transaction, there's usually some documentation that goes along with it. So in the next slide, we'll talk about how this kind of worked out. When you create something like that, you usually are sending a remittance back to the vendor, telling them what the payment was for and what invoice it was on. And that usually is sent out separate from someone who's actually processing that payment. And so in this case, instead of that just going directly out from the AP clerk, all the vendors who she was using to perpetrate her fraud were coming directly back to her. So she could then determine which ones should be sent out to the vendor, which are legitimate, and which ones were her misappropriation, which would not get sent out. So that was kind of how she got around that piece. And so in this situation, we ended up with it being 78 transactions and a little over $3.2 million. And in this situation, this was the largest part of the fraud that she actually perpetrated. But we think that the wire one probably would have got bigger if we didn't stop that from occurring. So we'll move to the next slide. So I think you're all asking, you know, this is a lot of money, and why didn't anyone notice? And I think one of the main things to point out here is because of the size of it, the board was starting to realize, like, why is our cash balance declining? What is going on? And asking a whole bunch of more questions. So it's not like they weren't on to this, but she always had a good excuse. She always had the right things to say to basically for them to accept, oh, well, you know, she's clearly explaining why we have a declining position, and that makes sense. So they were definitely on to it, but concealment is a little tough. So on the next slide, we're going to show a little bit about some of the things that she said. And again, these are from her deposition. So for wire transfers, she would describe them as an investment purchase, or, you know, on accounting records. She always had an example. She always had something to say. And the ACH transfers, she would just describe it, if anyone asked, as an additional expense or something that was out of the ordinary, an insurance expense or a maintenance expense or something like that. So those are where we really need to, you know, be careful. And again, instead of just asking that question, it might have been better for the commissioner to ask for some additional support to see, does that really make sense with their understanding? All right, next slide. Here's a couple other of her quotes. I would imagine that the questions would arise from dwindling account balances on the cash report. So like, what would she say? She would explain it's because certain expenses are unexpected, or we experience substantial increase in an insurance premiums, or a new consulting firm. She always had an answer that sounded reasonable. And again, when they get caught up in that, they're ready to respond in a way that, you know, it seems to make sense. But we always have to do that one more step and verify. Next slide, Brandy. So what else? As auditors, anytime we have a fraud, we already know that there were two different ways in which funds were being misappropriated by COVA. And we always have to look into everything else. And so, you know, we looked at payroll, we looked at other areas, but the one other place that we looked at had to do with the credit cards. So when we deal with credit cards, as many of you know, external credit card fraud happens on occasion, especially when you're at a larger organization. And so they actually had a policy for that. And the policy for the Housing Authority was to file a dispute with a credit card company and attach the dispute form to the credit card and track it to ensure that the credits are received in the months that follow. So that's the normal process. But in this case, there was some controls that were lacking, and that last part where you track to ensure the credit was in a subsequent month, there was some change in staff, and that may not have got reassigned. So the next slide, Brandy. So just when we were going through the process, we looked through the credit card expenditures. We found some things that weren't, you know, could have been personal. It's really hard to say. A vendor like Amazon, you could be getting something that's relevant to work or not. But we did see a vendor for an online gaming company. And we know that the last time I checked, I've been involved with housing authorities for a while. I don't think online gaming was something you guys do on a regular basis or is allowable. So that one, we kind of knew it belonged to her, because when we actually got her records, her own banking records, her own credit card information, we saw a lot of payments to that online gaming company. So we knew that that was her. We also found emails that were in her email box that showed that she had been using that site. So, and the other thing too, so next slide. This was a situation where COVA was one step ahead. So she knew that she was creating this fraud. So she brought this to the attention of the executive director and the chair of the board, and basically let them know that, hey, there's been some fraud on our actual Visa cards, and it's going to take a few billing cycles to clear up. But she actually notified them of her own fraud. And then to follow up on that, she reached out to the AP clerk and basically said, you know, this is coming. When this fraudulent bill gets in your hands, let me know and I'm going to take care of it. So she just alerted them, yeah, don't fall out of your chair when you get the next Visa bill. I'll take care of the fraud claims if you would just forward me the bill. So basically getting her own fraud into her own hands to take care of. So that's what that gets down to. And so what we found was 195 credit card transactions for a total of $25,565. And this again was the smallest piece of her fraud. It was also the first kind of step in her fraud as well. On the next slide, we are going to kind of provide you with a visual in how, over time, of how the fraud occurred. As you can see, she started with the credit card, which is a small amount, and then kicked pretty heavy in 2017 into the ACH vendor type transaction fraud. And then she has the wire transfer that's going to start in 2018. And that was really for the property purchase in Oklahoma. And then the wire fraud just really starts to take off. And that one was the one where, you know, we actually caught that in July and it stopped, but that one probably would have gotten bigger had we not stopped. But that's just kind of an overlay of that. We'll show that in another form. So in summary, this is kind of how it laid out. This is actually taken from our audit report where it documents the 4 various types of fraud that was occurring. And in that first year, the credit card payments, and then that stopped and the ACH started. So when our audit caught it, it was in 2018 when we were doing that audit. And so it was that $635,000 wire transfer to a title company that caught our attention. But then we went back and did the other work. But in your mind, you're all thinking, hey, auditors, where were you? How come you didn't catch this sooner? And the real issue that I would go back to is we didn't necessarily focus in on ACH transactions or credit card payments in 2016 or 17, but she was using known vendors. So this one would have been a little harder to catch. But we have done a lot of changes in our office. And one of the things you might have noticed on some of your own audits is we've started to audit user access now, because there were some missing controls in place, and also really looking at authority in those areas of credit cards and ACH and making sure controls are better. So we have improved our audit process through audits like this, but now that's just the big details of the audit. And now we're going to kind of roll into some more questions as I hand it over to Brandy. But if you do have any additional questions, please put them in the chat. We're going to get through a lot of stuff, but hopefully at the end we'll have time for questions and we'll do our best to get through those. So Brandy, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. So one of the questions that we've pondered, and I think others ponder as well, is what is so unique about this housing authority that would allow this particular misappropriation to occur, or what was so unique about this particular misappropriation? But the real answer is nothing. This is a very classic textbook example of what's seen out in the industry. And so as a comparison, the ACFE puts out a report to the nations every couple years. They just put out their 2021, and this is where they're surveying fraud professionals across the globe, excuse me, and asking questions, providing or gathering stats and feedback on the types of fraud that are going out there. So let's compare the housing authority to what these guys say are the most common frauds. So in the report to nations, they say the most common scheme is asset misappropriation, and that's what we had at the housing authority. The report to nations says that 1/3 of their cases involved more than one scheme. As Sadie mentioned, we had 3 schemes that we're dealing with here. Report to Nation says the top concealment method is creating fraudulent physical documents. And I mean, she concealed her misappropriation in multiple ways, but creating fraudulent vendor invoices was definitely one of those. Entities with less than 100 employees had the highest median loss. I think we all would like to think that the bigger the organization, the bigger the loss, but that's not statistically the case. And again, here the Housing Authority had roughly 40 employees. As far as the length of employment of the fraudster, long-term employees still twice as much. It's the classic trusted employee scenario, and COVID's been at the Housing Authority for over 20 years. As far as behavioral red flags, 85% of fraudsters display at least one behavioral red flag. And so I pulled out some of our conversations with various housing authority staff and took out a few little quotes. So some of the things we heard was she was difficult, things changed, she would roll her eyes and come in late, her attitude was different, staff is required to take a 40-hour block of time away, which she did not do. And we just started seeing her spend money. I just thought she would squeeze the juice from life. So definitely some behavioral red flags, and also that she hated that, excuse me, that I demanded redundancy. So what can we learn from this case? So we're gonna kind of go through this step by step. And the first piece we're gonna talk about is the culture of the Housing Authority. So everything went through the finance director first and foremost. And as we talked about, as we talked to staff about their control processes, there always seemed to be a point where every person said, and then the transaction went to COVA, and they didn't really know what happened at that. So it really seemed to be all roads led there. And in fact, just a little commentary, I was speaking to the auditor the other day, and she said that, again, when she found these transactions, COVA was actually out of the office, and staff were a little reluctant at first to even help her through her questions. They even kept saying, I don't know about this, you need to talk to COVA. And so the auditor had to kind of pull on that string a little bit to get them to help her investigate some of these transactions further. Staff also seemed to be really siloed in their duties. Person A didn't always know what person B was doing or why they were doing it. They had their own responsibilities and they pretty much just stuck to them. And that was a big problem because it became clear that staff didn't always know how their responsibilities fit into that bigger picture of internal controls at the agency. And we'll talk about that again here momentarily. And in fact, here's a quote from one of the interviews that I think really demonstrates that. She said, I just stick to myself and try to survive the day. So they weren't always thinking globally outside of their own responsibilities. And even the executive director told us he didn't really know his finance staff very well. And the staff told us that they didn't feel that they had access to the executive director or the board. Again, everything from top to bottom, bottom to top, everything flowed through COVA. So the big lesson learned here is, of course, to create a culture of accountability, truly adopt and exhibit the mentality that if you see something, you should say something, and you should encourage that. Make sure everybody knows that every one of them play a part in preventing and detecting fraud. So the similarity here is, you hear it's not just on the IT department to be responsible for an entity's cybersecurity health. And similarly, it's not just the finance department that takes a role in fraud prevention and detection. Also, we would encourage cross-agency transparency and communication so people know how they fit into that bigger control picture at the agency. And then the last one is talking about a whistleblower hotline, and we'll talk about that one. I can click on the right thing here. There we go. So in the 2020 ACFE report to the nations, and this has been really consistent, tips continue to be the most common way that fraud is detected. So as you can see, fraud losses were 50% smaller, the organization with hotlines, and those with hotlines detect frauds up to 6 months quicker than those without. So what we've found is a whistleblower hotline can take a lot of forms, and our office right now is working on some resources that we can provide. It can be as simple as having a whistleblower policy that says, hey, person in Department A, here's somebody in Department B that you can go talk to if you have concerns. So they feel like they have that safe outlet outside of their department. Or it could be as sophisticated as an actual phone number or hotline. And there's lots of tools for that. There's a lot of vendors that provide this actually quite cheap. And there's a great article actually out on ACFE, and they talk about this. I believe it was in the January-February 2020 edition, and they have some great takeaways too. Like, for example, just as an aside, they say that because we're moving more to a digital world, they're finding more success in types of hotlines that are set up as like you can email something or do an online form as compared to our old school, pick up the phone and call somebody. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about is oversight. So COVA was not providing timely information to the board, and they were definitely asking for it, but she had been refusing a little bit to provide that to them. And in fact, the board had actually contracted with a vendor to come in and help train COVA and the other staff on how to provide financial information and how the board could better understand that. Unfortunately, the timing of that was that contractor was supposed to start right about the time that we found the fraud, and they put her on administrative leave. So again, back to what Sadie was saying, they were picking up on some of the problems that were happening and were starting to attempt to solve them. They almost had a good control, and that invoices over $2,500 required management approval, but there was no requirement for management to actually sign off or otherwise show evidence that they had approved it. So, I mean, it's really hard to know what was or wasn't actually approved. It was clear in our interview with the executive director that there was just a lot of trust placed in COVA. And it's something that we see a lot in entities of all sizes and levels of sophistication. So we often hear things like, hey, we hired that person to do that job, so we're going to trust that they're going to do that. And that kind of seems what was happening here. The finance staff reported to COVA, so the only people that could really effectively monitor COVA were the executive director and the board, but they weren't necessarily doing that in a great amount of detail. And in fact, the executive director had never seen a bank statement prior to us presenting them as part of our investigation. And he even told us that he didn't even really know of QuickBooks. He just said that basically he relied largely on the finance director's reports to the board. And we heard many statements that everyone relied on, or it was quite obvious. And this also seemed to be partnered with some resistance from COVA to have it any other way, really. When the board tried to get better information, she wouldn't provide it. The executive director commented that she was really pushing back when he was asking for some redundancy in procedures. And again, staff didn't feel like that they could go to her with any suggestions or clarifications. So some controls. I mean, really the bottom line is just that management and elected officials need to be active participants in the internal control process and active in the auditing process as well. And kind of going down to that last bullet, I think we've all probably worked with that person who can be a little difficult. Maybe they're stuck in doing things a certain way. They want sole control over their duties. They don't want to share their duties, and they definitely don't want to change up the way they do things just for the sake of internal controls. So we're not saying all those people are committing fraud, but what we are saying is that your internal control system should be strong, even if one person doesn't like it. So it might be tempting to negotiate or compromise to appease a strong personality, but obviously that's not what we would recommend. All right, so our next piece is access. So note the controls, really there was a very overarching weakness that was at the heart of everything, and that's that COVA had access to all systems. She had wire transfer capability, and there just really wasn't a lot of monitoring of what she was doing. She really was that stereotypical trusted employee. So one of our audit steps was looking at the various software systems, and we looked at each person's access and permissions. And we found employees and departments had access to make changes in modules that didn't really line up to their department responsibilities or even their specific job duties. We also found 3 staff who could change vendor account information, including ACH bank account numbers. And we'll talk some more about that on the next slide. But one thing that was interesting here was that they had designated very clearly one person who was on point for setting up new vendors. And that seemed to be a very solidified official process to set up a new vendor in the system. And I think they felt really confident in that process. But what they didn't think through maybe was that as soon as that official process happens to set up the vendor, somebody could go in 2 seconds later and then change all that information. So that strong control they had up front was easy to go around the next day. And that's what COVA did. After somebody set up the vendor, she went in and changed that ACH banking account information. Also, one person ran the ACH file out of the accounting system and then saved it to a shared drive before sending it to the bank. And so anybody who had access to that shared drive could have accessed that file and made changes as well. So the controls here, pretty easy stuff here. You know, evaluate each person's job responsibility along with their access and permissions, restrict them when possible. And of course, segregate key duties from key access. So the next piece we'll talk about is internal controls. So Sadie talked about some of these earlier, so we'll kind of touch on them briefly, but I mentioned that COVA had access to change vendor payment information, and the icing on the cake, unfortunately, was that the system didn't keep an audit trail when people went in and made those changes to the vendor account. So that kind of made it difficult for them to be able to monitor who had been making changes to vendors. So we'd recommend some pretty basic steps. Segregate key duties. If staff review the work of their supervisor, all questions on that work should go to somebody above their supervisor. Also evaluate inherent internal control weaknesses within your IT system and try to think through and develop some manual controls that are going to help compensate for that. And stick to your controls. As we saw, COVA asked others to bypass their normal processes, and they did it. Even though those vendor remittances usually got mailed straight to the vendors, when she put a Post-it note on there and said, for these ones, send it to me, people did that. They had that internal control process for credit card disputes, but when she asked for that to be different for certain transactions, people followed that. So stick to your process, and if you think you have a true reason to go outside of it, because things happen, seek some higher levels of approval. Knowledge is the next piece. So I've read through one particular interview numerous times. It's the one that really sticks with me. We're asked a lot about the bank reconciliation process and why didn't that process catch all of these wires, especially the ones that went directly to COVA. And the answer is that the person responsible for those bank reconciliations didn't necessarily understand the purpose of that control that she was performing. So in the interview, she explained that bank reconciliation process to us as really a numbers-only reconciliation. She said, I look just at the number, not too much of what it is. So she's just comparing dollar amounts to dollar amounts and checking them off. So when we asked her about transaction descriptions on the bank statement, she said, I may glance at it, but I don't really pay that much attention to it. And in the interview, we actually showed her one of the bank statements that had some wires to COVA. And even then, she didn't really pick up on it. She said, yeah, if it was weird, I probably just would have asked COVA about it or flagged it for her attention. So it wasn't actually, she left the interview still not really having picked up on what we were getting at, because she didn't realize that we were, at that point conducting a fraud investigation. And it was actually later that day that it kind of dawned on her and she came back and, realized what was going on. And those types of conversations are really tough where, I don't know this gal personally, but I imagine that this is a hard situation to go through where, these fraudulent transactions are staring her in the face. And because she was focused on numbers to numbers and not realizing that the intent of her bank reconciliation should have also been a bit of a bank statement review, I imagine that that's probably a hard pill to swallow in retrospect when we're looking back. Another big problem is that those ACH payments are batched on the bank statements. They aren't shown individually. So, even if she would have found those particular ACH things on the bank statements, and us as auditors, we see one line that says ACH payments. So the only way to really dig through and see what lumped up into those was the supporting JVs, which COVA was responsible for. So they were often confusing and not always processed timely. So some controls. Staff should have enough knowledge and training to adequately review the financial information. Encourage staff to remain curious, to remain inquisitive. Approach reviews with professional skepticism and ask questions. Don't just assume that if something looks weird, there must be a logical explanation, or stay clear of it because that's somebody else's responsibility. I'm not allowed to ask about that. And each control has a purpose, and it's incredibly important that everyone knows what that is. In the case of PCHA, the key control over bank activity was that reconciliation, but the person performing that role only thought that her purpose was to compare those numbers. And so just some final red flags here. So HUD-OIG has stated that many of the fraudulent payments they see in the housing authority world are coded to maintenance expense, and that was one of the places that COVA coded her misappropriation. So it's a good little tip. Also, it's intuitive, but if you have numerous or duplicative software systems, it's obviously going to increase the complexity, and it's going to raise the risk of error or misappropriation. And similarly, the more bank accounts you have, the harder it is to monitor and reconcile them. And lastly, consider the documents that you're reviewing and where that information is coming from, and can you really trust it? So in this case, COVA was able to enter in a description when she made wires. So I know, it seems like if I looked at a bank statement, I would assume and this is a great example, if the bank statement says wire withdrawal investments, I would assume it must have been for investments because the bank is telling me so. But that's actually a field that COVA entered when she processed those wires online. So again, think about the source of the information that you're using. So some final thoughts to consider. Make sure that you're looking at your insurance coverage for employee theft or loss. I think we covered this in our report, but we have a loss of almost $7 million, and the Housing Authority's insurance was only $500,000, so that left a pretty large gap in coverage. And really, thinking about who are your high-value employees, and do you have a performance bond on those particular employees? And if you do have one, is it giving you enough coverage? So again, just our big drive home point is just remember professional skepticism and trust but verify. I know sometimes, and obviously we can say this as auditors, we don't always like to ask that one more question because sometimes we know we're annoying people when we're asking that one more question. But asking a question isn't a sign of distrust necessarily. It's just part of the healthy control process. And so definitely encouraging that in your organizations, that it's okay to ask questions and get to the bottom of things. So where's the case now? As far as we know, so on the civil side, SAO and the Attorney General's office approved a partial restitution agreement between the parties. And then on the criminal side, we sent it to the FBI. She was arrested March 2nd and was released, and then with the expectation that she would come back to Washington State for a court appearance. The grand jury did indict her on 4 federal counts of wire fraud. My understanding is that I think she has an upcoming court appointment, but I honestly don't know if that, I doubt that's the full case. I'm guessing it's just a status hearing or something, but that's all we know on that part. So just a couple reminders, if fraud happens to you, state law says you have to report it and report it immediately. It covers known or even just suspected losses. And if you ever have questions, call us. We'd be happy to talk you through any of your questions on whether you should report something. Make sure that if you feel like a fraud has happened, secure your records. That's a huge piece. And maybe start to document a timeline of what you found, who you've talked to, and the actions that you've taken. Consider changing locks. If, you know, and these are obviously going to be dependent on the situation, but consider changing your locks, removing system access. We have far too many ad stories of, for example, credit card fraud. They notify our office a credit card fraud happened, but they don't actually remove that person from that credit card. So they just continue to rack up these fraudulent charges. So yeah, the third one there, removing access to bank and credit card accounts. And then of course, we're always going to recommend that you report it to law enforcement. So what you don't want to do is enter into a restitution agreement unless it's been approved by the state auditor's office and the attorney general's office, and that's by law. Don't ever let the employee repay it just and then tell them that that's going to make it go away. Can't make any promises that you're not going to report it to law enforcement and to our office, or that it won't go to court. And then of course, don't physically prevent them from leaving. If you do pursue personnel action, so if you're at that time, you think something's happened, you want to put somebody on admin leave, we always recommend that the reason for that is some type of a violation of policy or procedures. Don't say that you're putting them on leave or terminating due to misappropriating public funds, because you're not at that point yet, right? Unless they've actually gone to court and that's been proven, we can't make that statement. So there's that little tidbit. So Sadie and I are here chatting with you today, but Stephanie and Sarah are the faces of our fraud program, and so we have their contact information there. And we have our fraud@sao.wa.gov email address, which we all monitor, so that's a great place to get a hold of us as well. And we have time for questions.
So if anybody does have any questions, please do put it into the chat box. We can get those answered. I just want to say that I've heard this presentation a couple times now, and every single time I hear it, I think about something else. I think about, okay, what is that internal control? What is that process that I have? Is there a hole there that I need to fill? So it's good that you're constantly thinking about that, even though if you think you've got it filled, there's always something. You know, creativity and imagination is out there. So there's always something that you probably could think of that could get through the cracks and that you need to address in some point. I just made a note of probably about 5 things that I want to look into with my internal controls. And I do that constantly. So I really want to appreciate you going over this case with us and discussing internal controls with us and really bringing it to the forefront of all of our minds. So with that, if there's any questions.
I got a question off to the side here. The question is, COVA had accused the ex-director of
Complicity in the fraud, yep.
Complicity in the fraud. He has been cleared and reinstated. Any ideas why she tried that? We don't know. We don't know the details. Again, Kova was willing to talk to us, but we didn't ask that particular question. So we're not sure why she tried, but
I think we can all make speculations, but that's kind of really where it lands. Yeah. That was that's a piece that we don't really talk about within this presentation, but we did have a leg of our investigation to try to see if it looks like he was involved because she had accused him, and ultimately, like, we didn't see anything. We couldn't say for sure one way or the other, but we didn't see anything. But she also said that the situation there, that we wouldn't find emails or phone calls or records. So, I mean, what do you do with that? We looked at his bank statements, but I mean, there wasn't a whole lot we could do on that. So. I know there's more questions.
just questions for the state auditor's office. That works too.
Yeah, we have Ann Strand here. So if you have any questions about audits generally or cycles or anything, we've got her on tap as well.
Oh, wait. Okay. Got another one. How is the transition to virtual audits working for SAO? Well, I can tell you from my perspective, and then I'll let Ann and Brandy talk too. I think it's been a challenge. We always have been set up to do remote work with our laptops and working from home. I think the issue that we're having probably the most is when you're talking about dealing with the pandemic and COVID, that has a huge effect on operations at all of our state and local governments. And so we're realizing that, you know, the turnaround time is a little slower, but for the most part, we're still auditing. We're still out there and we're still doing it. Yeah, I mean, Ann, Brandy, any other comments?
I just want to say that the Housing Authority community has talked to us in the past about trying to work more remotely, more outside of your office. So if anything, you helped us kind of steer our way towards what we're doing now. So that's great. I think for the most part, the transition at the beginning was huge. We jumped in with both feet and did everything we could to make the transition as smoothly as possible. We've been very lucky that our clients have been so on board with it and so helpful in providing everything that we need. So there's still hurdles and hiccups, but you know, the communication is really the biggest, most important thing that makes it work. So just keeping that open communication, the dialogue, the providing the documents, whatever way possible, has really made it successful so far. So that's, I really just appreciate everyone that's been involved.
Yeah, it's allowed us to put more emphasis on some of the things that we already had in play. You know, like Ann mentioned, we had been talking to the Housing Authority community about moving this way. So we had a big start in this anyway, but for example, we have this, we call it a PBC list or a document request list, and that really got pushed up to the top of our priorities of like, let's nail this thing down, make sure all auditors have availability to get this list out to all of their clients as much ahead of time as possible. And then same thing, our pre-audit meetings, which is not an entrance conference, it's something we do before the audit is even started to ask like, okay, how are we going to get documents? Do you want to scan them? Can we get remote access? Do you want us to show up and grab a box or schedule a day on site? It's figuring out that administrative stuff. So a lot of those things have just become increasingly important, and fortunately, they've been working really well for us. So that next question, were any major changes made to SAO audits after this fraud was detected? Maybe not major changes. I think Sadie mentioned earlier that a bigger focus on ACH and EFT controls, and that's in part because of this fraud and in part because the number of ACH frauds, externally driven ACH frauds, has just been astronomical, of people, you know, calling your organization and saying, hey, I'm your vendor, change my bank account, or posing as an employee and asking to change those EFTs. Just, it's remarkable how many of those have been happening the last couple of years. So kind of those two combinations have led to a higher focus on those ACH EFT controls. The other thing I'll say too is that whenever these things happen, I mean, the gal Christina, she's our auditor in Tacoma, and I had a great conversation with her recently about the professional skepticism, because there's a lot of things as an auditor that pull away from your professional skepticism. And Kova's a great example. We watched her being very loud and aggressive towards her own employees. So that, you can imagine, could be intimidating to an auditor of, do I want to keep pestering her with these questions when I've seen her react like that to her own staff? So there are a lot of things that make us maybe gun shy in asking the things that we want to ask. So I think it's, listening to her story has been a great reminder to all of our staff of, like, it's okay. It's okay to ask those extra questions. You're not trying, again, we know we pester you guys. We know we're annoying. We know it. We'll own it. But it's okay. It's okay to do that sometimes to get to your ultimate goal. So it's just been a good reminder. Sadie, do you have anything to add on that? Or anything I'm missing?
No, I think it really heightened our awareness, making sure that, like a wire transfer, this is a lot of money. How come this doesn't have two people involved with that process? I mean, I think it just brings to light that we are living in an electronic world, and the pandemic has highlighted that too, where there is a lot of changes that may have been made in your own operations due to the pandemic, because we're not in the office and we're operating remotely. And so you really got to say, okay, we're in a different environment now than we were 6 months ago. Do we have controls to handle that? And that's tough, because everyone has more work than they have time for. But a lax in those controls can allow fraud to occur. We already know, and Brandy kept bringing up the ACFE, and that organization with COVID and the massive amount of money coming to state and local governments, and there's already massive frauds. I mean, again, I'm heavily involved in what's going on with the ESD. So it's happening on a large scale, and it will continue. And so just, again, be cognizant and really, really key in on those controls that you need to have in place.
Lori nailed it. Document, in the words of Pat McCarthy, document, yes. Document. Yes.
You will always hear that from our fearless leader, and she will say it again and again. You have to document what you're doing. Keep it up. Keep it up. All right. Well, we really, really appreciate your time today. And if you have any additional questions, please reach out to us.
As always, thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. If you have anything, don't hesitate to reach out to them by email. The recording will be up by the end of the week. If there's anything we can do, be sure to email pnrc@naro.org. And the code is on the screen for you to get your 100 points. And the next session starts in 7 minutes. Thank you, everyone, and especially to our presenters. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.